Hello everyone and welcome to Configuring Azure AD Connect like the pros. This is Max Fritz, a solutions architect at SADA Systems. You can find me on Twitter at @thecloudsherpa. We'll go ahead and get started here. A little bit about myself. I am, as I said, a solutions architect at a company called SADA Systems in California who can help with all sorts of Microsoft Cloud consulting needs. Please do feel free to get in touch with me. The contact details at the bottom right corner if you need anything or have any questions about today's presentation. I also run the Office 365 user group in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and I've been working with Microsoft Cloud for over 8 years. And this is really my focus area on the Microsoft Cloud identity space. A few assumptions before you start joining us today. I do assume that you have a familiarity level with Microsoft Cloud services, either Azure AD, which is Azure Active Directory, or Office 365, which uses Azure AD as the directory service behind it. Either or would work. I also assume that you're familiar with Active Directory. In no way do you need to be a professional at Active Directory, but you understand some of the basic concepts of the different object types like computers and users and organizational units. And then that you're familiar with basic PowerShell usage. What I mean by that is that you're able to run some commands with instructions, not that you need to be a pro at running PowerShell. All right, with that, we'll get started with an overview. So I really want to talk about the history of Azure AD Connect, how we got to where we are today in 2019. And it's an interesting story if you go along with it, of the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud Identity Timeline. And this is because Azure AD Connect is technically a technology to help us create a hybrid identity between our local identities and our cloud identities. So when Microsoft Online Services started out, way back before we had the name of Office 365, for those of you who've been with me for a long time, you remember the days of BPOS, Business Productivity Online Suite. This is before Microsoft had the Azure naming scheme or anything. We had a situation of where we had usernames, passwords in the cloud, and we had our users locally. And we had to kind of create things in different places to keep things in sync. And so, in 2009, we had a technology called DirSync introduced, short for Directory Synchronization. And that allowed us to synchronize our identities from a local Active Directory to the cloud, simply so that we could have them match. We could have certain attributes sync up, like somebody's department, or their office location, or their phone number even. And DirSync is the technology that still powers Azure AD Connect today. You'll even hear me call it DirSync a few times probably. In 2012, we had DirSync renamed into Azure AD Sync. We had it become a little bit more friendly of a program to work with, and this allowed us to actually take advantage of a little bit of the Azure branding that we saw come out a few years before that, and made it easier for everyone to install. In 2013, we had a new feature added, and that was password hash synchronization. And that allowed us to take passwords from our local Active Directory and make them available in Azure Active Directory, so that users who sign into things like Office 365 can sign in with the same password in both places. While this technology technically exists in a different fashion through Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS, this is the first time we saw it a little bit more simplified and added through Azure AD Connect, or Azure AD Sync at the time. And in 2015, we had the product simply renamed from Azure AD Sync to Azure AD Connect. With that rename came a few more bells and whistles, where we could actually configure things a little bit better through a graphical interface. And we had a new health engine introduced, which allowed Azure to manage this appliance and let us know when things are syncing properly and when things are not working. And then most recently in 2017, we had 3 things introduced. One of them is a little bit more technical. We had the source anchor, which we'll talk about a little bit later today, changed, or at least the default was changed, from an object GUID to MSDS consistency GUID. Remember that, we'll come back to that. And 2 new technologies introduced, pass-through authentication and seamless single sign-on. Those allow us to create a little bit more of a seamless, forgive the pun, sign-on experience for our users who are using Azure AD Connect. So if my user is using a local machine and they want to sign in to Office 365, they're able to get in a little bit more easily. There's plenty of information about those. We don't have time to cover them today, but feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and hopefully we'll have another session on that later. So, you may be looking at this thinking, okay, great history, but just let's talk about what Azure AD Connect is, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. What is Azure AD Connect? Azure AD Connect, Azure Active Directory Connect, is an application installed on a Windows server on your environment. It could actually be on a Windows workstation even if you want to, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's simply an MSI installer, quick walkthrough process that we'll go through together and show some of the advanced configurations, of course. And it really integrates those local AD with the Azure AD side of things. It's actually based off a technology called Microsoft Identity Manager, formerly known as Forefront Identity Manager. We'll call it MIM for short. And MIM really is about synchronizing identities and manipulating identities between different sources. All sorts of different things like Oracle databases and Active Directory and online identities, all sorts of things like that. And this is a simplified version of it. And it actually uses a SQL installation to manage the sync database, to manage what's going on the back end. Now, this can be a separate SQL server. We'll talk about that in a few minutes here, but it comes with it. You don't need to license SQL separately. It is a SQL Express instance that's installed with this appliance. It comes with that Azure AD Connect Health component that we talked about. And lastly, this is a free appliance. It's a free download from the Microsoft site. All you need to do is have an Azure Active Directory license, which is free to go and get. So if you haven't started with Azure AD, you can go sign up for that today. There's some stipulations, of course, if you are not paying for it. If you're an Office 365 customer, you're already using it. And some of you even have premium licensing out there. So more visually, what does it really do? Well, if we look at this diagram here, we've got our local ADDS, which stands for Active Directory Domain Services. We've got our Azure AD Connect, and we've got things like our Azure Active Directory, that logo here, as well as some cloud applications. And right now, all those are disparate, but when Azure AD Connect gets in the way, we actually start synchronizing between them. So, an identity from my local AD can be used all the way down on something like Salesforce or Office 365 or even custom applications you develop. And that's all because of that sync engine you see on the bottom there. And additionally, we have our health bridge, which is going to show us when things are working, when things are not, and allow us to do some initial remediation. So, what kind of things do we need to do before we install Azure AD Connect together? Well, we've got to look at the prerequisites. So, to install Azure AD Connect, I'm going to need, first of all, a verified domain in Azure Active Directory. That's not technically required, but it's going to be necessary for this to work properly. What that means is I take a domain like mine, like maxafritz.com, and go through the verification steps, either in Office 365 or Azure AD, and then I'll need a global admin account to run through the process of installing. Now, it's not going to cache my credentials or anything like that, but what it will do is it will use that to give permissions to the appliance to actually do what it needs to do. In my on-premises AD, more detailed requirements. My schema version and force functional level need to at least be at Server 2003. I hope you're already there, and I hope you're even beyond that at Server 2008 R2, because password writeback, which is a feature you can use if you have more advanced licensing, requires Server 2008 R2, as well as a lot of other things that you'll just be happier at 2008 R2. If you're not sure what level you have, feel free to reach out to me. I can give you some simple instructions, but check with your AD admin if you're not that person. You also need a writable domain controller, accessible from wherever we install Azure AD Connect. So you can't just install it on a home computer that doesn't have connectivity. It also, lastly, needs an enterprise admin account. Similar to a global admin account, this is for installation only, just to give it the rights it needs to. Some more prerequisites: the server itself that we install it on. It needs to be Server 2008 or later with the latest hotfixes. Now keep in mind, support for that is coming to a close pretty soon, so you might want to get that on a Server 2012 or later, or even Server 2016. We need .NET Framework 4.5.1 and PowerShell 3.0. You got to connect to the internet and resolve DNS for both your local AD and the internet. But interestingly enough, we don't need a domain join machine. So, What we do need, though, is a 1.6 gigahertz CPU of 2 cores at least, memory at a minimum of 4 gigs, and hard drive at 70 gigs or more. Now you'll notice that says depending on objects in Active Directory. And Microsoft has published some detailed instructions for us. So, if you run a count of how many objects you have in Active Directory, that includes computers, users, contacts, all sorts of things like that. If you have fewer than 10,000, you only need 4 cores and 8 gigs with 80 gigabytes free space. But as you look on this chart further and further down, you could need a lot more processing power and a lot more free space. The one thing I do want to note at the very bottom here is if you have 100,000 more or more objects in AD, the full version of SQL Server is required on a separate server installed. And Microsoft does not provide a free license for that in that case. You do need to have a SQL installation license. Now, I said we'd talk more about SQL, and here's where we can do that. A lot of SQL admins will say, I don't want a SQL Express sitting out on an Azure AD Connect server, even if we have fewer than 50,000 objects or 100,000 objects. And my personal recommendation, if you can get away with having that SQL Express server, if you're less than 100,000 objects, please do it. Azure AD Connect is very good at managing that SQL Express database. The moment you put that on a separate SQL server, you have a lot more management to do, both in networking and database management. This is a core service for your identities, and you don't want this to go down simply because SQL maintenance needs to be performed or certain operations aren't working properly. Microsoft has made this an all-in-one appliance that does a good job at what it does, and if you can get away with having the SQL Express that's installed with this, I would go ahead and do that. Now our other requirements are going to be on the external networking side. You do have internal networking requirements. I'm going to make an assumption that you have a full internal network connectivity to a domain controller on the server you're going to install it on, but Microsoft does have published internal networking requirements, and I'm happy to point those out to you. Externally, the server needs to be able to go outbound on port 80 and 443. Now, if we use some of the more advanced features, we're going to have more advanced networking requirements, but this is at least a basic set of requirements for us. Now, some additional recommendations from the field. In your local AD, number 1, make sure the domain that you're going to use in Azure AD, something like maxafritz.com, is available as a UPN suffix within local AD. What that means is that all your identities aren't just something.local. They're actually a routable domain that you're going to use in Azure AD. We'll look at that. And enable your AD recycling bin if it's not already enabled. Makes it easy to recover from mistakes, not only in Azure AD Connect, but in general life. For the server itself, make sure to go install Azure AD PowerShell Commandlets version 2, and try to use a virtual machine. Most of us are doing that anyways nowadays, but it allows for snapshots and easy recovery. And lastly, consider hosting the server in Azure for high availability. Okay, let's get in and look at configuration of Azure Active Directory. In this scenario, I have a domain, mf-dc1 is my domain controller, and all of my server, that domain name is fritzium.com. I also have a server ready for us to use, mf-aadc1 for Azure Active Directory Connect. Nothing's installed on there yet, just a plain Windows server. And we have an Azure AD instance with fritzium.com there. And we're going to go ahead and install Azure AD Connect and see how easy it is to get it set up from a base. So here we are on our Azure AD Connect server, ready to install. I've gone ahead and downloaded the Azure AD Connect MSI installer from Microsoft, which you can find Googling or on Bing, just looking on the Microsoft download site. It's updated once in a while, I'd say once every month or a little bit more frequently sometimes. Usually the installation files for this are just fine, and I haven't seen any issues with Azure AD Connect installers in a little while, so you're usually fine there, but you can always look back a couple weeks if you need to as well, just to be sure. So we're going to go ahead and open this up and walk through the process. Alright, first we agree to the license terms and privacy notice. Feel free to read those on your own time. And then we get our big decision as IT pros. Do we want to use express settings? And I'm going to make a strong recommendation to you. Do not use express settings. Express settings will run through the install process. As soon as we give it our usernames and passwords to do the things it needs to, it's going to start synchronization right away before we even get a chance to customize a thing. So I recommend you hit customize and follow along on my steps. Alright, first and foremost, we've got 4 checkboxes. Explaining these for you. Custom install location, pretty clear. It's going to go in C program files, but we can say somewhere else if we want to. Do we want to use an existing SQL Server instance? This is where we could point it at that SQL Server. Do we want to use existing service accounts? And I'm going to make a strong recommendation unless you have technical reasons that you need to use your own service accounts. Let it create the service accounts. It will use least privileged access principles to make sure that it creates accounts that only have the exact permissions needed. Running through that on your own can take hours with the specific permissions needed, especially in AD. And custom sync groups. This is kind of a holdover from the MIM, Microsoft Identity Manager days. It's really about who can administer this service, and I'm also going to recommend you don't do this. This is not about groups in Active Directory. This is actually groups on our local machine here. So I'm going to recommend you let it create the groups for you, and then we can modify those. So then we click Install. It's going to install all the components for us, and then we get to start customizing how the synchronization works. Alright, so the first decision we are presented with is how we want our users to sign in. When we talked about the history of Azure AD Connect, we did talk about password hash synchronization. But there are a few other authentication methods, including things like pass-through authentication, that newer one, Active Directory Federation services, even third parties like Ping Federate. Lastly, you can say do not configure, where we're not going to configure how passwords or sign-in is done, but we'll still synchronize our identities. For this demo here, we're going to talk about password hash synchronization. Lastly, we have our Seamless Single Sign-On checkbox, which is an additional feature that you can use to enable single sign-on for your users who are domain joined and have access to a domain controller. We're going to skip that as well today, keep things simple. First of all, it needs those global admin credentials. This is a hard requirement to sign in to Azure Active Directory. Once it has those global admin credentials, it can authenticate itself and start doing the actions that it needs to within Azure Active Directory. So let's let it authenticate with Microsoft Online. And it's going to examine what's in Azure Active Directory for us. Specifically, it wants to see what domains I have verified. Now I have to say that I want to use in my local AD, fritzium.com, which is my forest. I could connect to another forest as well. It automatically populated this because I'm domain joined. But as we talked about earlier, you do not have to be domain joined. You can connect to any forest you have network connectivity to. So we'll add that directory. And here is where we specifically can tell it to create a new account for us in Active Directory as a service account, or use an existing AD account. If we use an existing AD account, there is a large set of permissions that need to be applied that I mentioned earlier. You can click this link to learn exactly what permissions need to be set in there. I strongly recommend creating the account. It does not show you the password. It manages all that itself. It's a long password. And you put in here your enterprise admin username and credentials, and it will use those to create the permissions it needs to. And you can go audit those after the fact. Really a decision up to you. So we're going to put in ours. And let it create its own account. And it's configured that directory. Now we could add more directories right now as well. It can synchronize with an almost unlimited amount of forests to one Azure AD Connect. Now keep in mind, only one Azure AD Connect can be configured with one Azure Active Directory instance. So if you do have multiple forests, you do have to stick with that one Azure AD Connect server. Now it's going to want to know what to use as my sign-in name. In the cloud, we call that our user principal name. On premises, we have user principal names as well. It's usually best to match those up with each other, but you can use technically any parameter you want. Sometimes people use an email address. Now keep in mind, if you're going to use things, especially like an Exchange hybrid between your local Exchange and Exchange Online, user principal name to user principal name matching will make your life a lot easier and is almost required in some instances. So I strongly recommend making user principal name match. Now, we get to select what we want to do with filtering. We could synchronize our entire directory out there, but as you probably can imagine, your directory probably has lots of things that have been left over from years past. And you may not want every single thing being synchronized to the cloud, just for cleanliness sake. So selecting it by domains and OUs and syncing those selectively can actually help make it a little bit easier to manage. And that's what we're going to do here today. I'm actually going to say, I don't want to synchronize any of these. I'll keep computers on. But I do want to synchronize my users OU. I recommend keeping computers synced. We're not going to talk about hybrid manageability of computers today, but computers are a key component of Azure Active Directory and its feature offerings as well. So make sure you work with your computer team or systems management team, whoever that might be, to make sure that you're providing them what needs to be there as well, if it is a separate team. So we'll select those. Those can always be changed. And now we've got a little bit more advanced. First of all, are my users represented across multiple directories? What does this mean? This means maybe I'm in a merger acquisition scenario where we have two different forests. Both of those forests are going to be synchronized up, but my users have accounts in each forest. Well, which one do we want to use? How do we match users together? By mail attribute, same account name, specific attribute, things like that. We're only synchronizing one forest or one directory, so my users are only going to be represented once. Lastly, how do we want our users to be anchored together between Azure Active Directory and local AD? If we let Azure manage the source attribute, as we talked about before, we're going to be using MSDS consistency GUID. And if we actually look in an attribute editor together, we can actually see that that is used as an attribute in our identities locally in Active Directory. It's not used by almost anything, so Azure Active Directory will fill that in with a string of numbers and letters to basically tie that identity to the cloud one. So if things like names or sign-in names change, it still knows who's who. This used to be tied together with an object GUID for a variety of reasons. It's been changed, and that is thought of as a better option. However, you can change it back to object GUID or anchor them together however you'd like. I strongly recommend, though, that you stick with the MSDS consistency GUID. Now, why does it not say just choose MSDS consistency GUID? Well, that's because we're letting Azure manage it. Microsoft at some point may change their decision and say we want to use a different anchor instead. And this is saying we're going to let you take care of that. Lastly, for a pilot deployment, we can filter based on groups. This could technically be used in production. I don't recommend it, though, mainly because it becomes very difficult to figure out why people aren't syncing where they should be. And lastly, our optional features. Some of these will be grayed out based on things that don't exist in your Azure AD subscription or in your local AD schema, like I don't have Exchange. Some of these will be forced on based on what we selected before for user sign-in. And you can find out more about all these different optional features later. I'm going to click Next, and it is now going to install. Now there are two checkboxes here, very important. Number one, start the synchronization process when this completes. If I uncheck that, that means that my synchronization is completely disabled. That little footnote is important. I'd have to actually go enable synchronization with a PowerShell commandlet or rerun this wizard. And staging mode, which actually can be used to put this in a test mode to see what is going to happen before anything actually happens. Now we're going to live in the wild side and let it go, but staging mode is important. We're going to come back to that a little bit and talk about what we could use technically for a high availability scenario. So remember staging mode. We'll click install and it will go ahead and get everything ready for us. Alright, and with that, our configuration is complete. We can verify it's synchronizing, which we'll do in a moment. It is letting us know the AD recycling bin is not turned on against my own recommendations, and Azure AD is configured to use that consistency GUID. So go ahead and exit here, and we're going to open a small appliance to see how the synchronization is going, and that's called the Synchronization service. Now this is actually the client that we use in Microsoft Identity Manager, and we can see here every step that's happening. Full imports, which happen to grab both from our local directory, fritziem.com, and our on Microsoft domain to see what's in both locations. Then we do a full synchronization to what's called the Metaverse to, in our SQL table, figure out, okay, what exists in both places, what do we need to do in both places, what kind of updates do we need to make, and then perform exports in each location. So we can even see those exports. My updates here, I can see that it went ahead and updated some specific attributes on some specific groups. We can also see in our Azure portal, if we go to Azure Active Directory, our synchronization status. I can see right here, Azure AD Connect sync is now enabled, and last sync happened less than 1 hour ago. So now we're going to talk about high availability and disaster recovery real quickly. And the key concept here is it doesn't exist with Azure AD Connect. Only one Azure AD Connect instance can sync with an Azure AD tenant at a time. What we can do instead, though, is use that staging mode checkbox we saw before to set up a second server in what's called staging mode that prevents exports. And that server, though, will need to be manually taken out of staging mode whenever failover is desired. We don't want to let both servers run at the same time because that would actually cause conflicts and a pretty bad scenario in Azure AD Connect. So this is what it would look like to have a second server in staging mode. Just nothing would happen. Simple checkbox to make it happen. Identical setups, identical configuration if you want things to work properly. So whenever you configure something differently on one server, you'll have to do it on the other. Our next thing to talk about is PowerShell, how to actually manage this. So we've got a full management GUI, but what if we want to do more than that? Like everything Microsoft, we've got PowerShell. So we've got all sorts of things we can manage through PowerShell, and I'm going to show you some of the most common ones real quickly here. We've got the availability to start a manual sync. That sync happens every 30 minutes by default, a delta sync. We can force it with that start AD sync cycle command. If we want to start a fresh sync to clear out the SQL table, clear out the Metaverse, we can say policy type initial. We can also disable the default deletion threshold, change that threshold. That's there to keep us safe, but we can modify it if we need to, as well as a whole other list of commands. And lastly, some troubleshooting steps for you. Common steps: reboot the server and perform a full sync. Those are the best things I can tell you to do before you ask anyone for help. Common issues, though: sometimes your clock could be out of sync with Microsoft Time Server. Make sure that's in sync. Sometimes your synchronization server won't start on the service. That could be a GPO. That could be a password of service count changing. And lastly, sometimes passwords don't sync. You can turn it on and off. Try that again. But you could also trigger a manual password sync with a script I have linked right there for you. And lastly, in that sync service that we saw, you'll sometimes see some error codes. And here I've got a list for you of what all of those error codes mean. So I hope you enjoyed a quick configuring Azure AD Connect like the pros. I've got tons more advice for you and would love to talk to each and every one of you about how you can configure yours even more detailed. There's so much more to get into. Feel free to get in touch with me and enjoy the rest of MVP Days. Thanks.